welcome to this afternoon's HVG masterclass, all about ethics in volunteer management. I'm really excited about today's session. I think there'll be lots of food for thought. It will be a mixed session. We will have some presentations and then we'll break off into breakout rooms for discussion later in the session. The session will be about an hour long, so we'll finish about 4 o'clock. As I've already mentioned, we will keep people on mute for the time being, just so we don't have any interruptions. Please use the chat box. Will and I from the HVG committee will be monitoring that, and we will be dropping in extra comments and questions in there as we go along. So a huge thank you to Will this afternoon, who's our tech support for today, and for all of our speakers who you'll be introduced to in turn. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Matt Hick, who's the chair of HVG and who's going to introduce the session more fully. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for that lovely introduction. And thank you for all of you for coming along today to what I think is going to be a really fantastic session, and I'm very excited about today and to be able to introduce Katie and Rob, who are going to lead the session for us. Before I do that, though, I'd like to just kind of ask you just to cast your mind back to our January coffee afternoon for those of you that were here. At that session, we looked at a whole range of challenges that we might face as volunteer leaders and volunteer engagement professionals. And one of the questions that I asked during that session was, would our ethical compass be sprung to breaking point? And that question really kind of reflected, I think, the challenges that we're now starting to see in the sector, and the questions that have been raised around job displacement and job replacement, and the challenges that that might bring for us, as I say, as leaders of volunteers. And my thinking around that and the points that I raised around ethical decision making had sprung from an absolutely wonderful article that I'd read on Engage by Katie, who is here with us today. And I'm not going to say any more about the article at the moment, but it really kind of is what prompted us to arrange today's session and to invite Katie along. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that she was able to join us, and as I say, is going to be leading today's session along with Rob. For those of you that don't know Katie Campbell, Katie has worked in the field of non-profit and volunteer management for over 30 years as a practitioner, trainer, author and leader. And she's taught at several Virginia colleges and holds the put my teeth in properly, and is certified in volunteer administration. Katie is currently working part-time as an independent consultant and manages the local service enterprise program in Richmond, Virginia. Many of you will already know Rob, but for those of you that don't, Rob Jackson is director of Rob Jackson Consulting, a consultancy and training company that helps engage and inspire people to bring about change. And Rob has more than 26 years working in the voluntary and community sector, holding a variety of strategic development and senior management roles that are focused on leading and engaging volunteers. And they are going to run what I think is going to be an absolutely fantastic session on ethics in volunteer management and leadership. I'm not going to really say any more because I don't want to steal their thunder, but I am going to hand you over to Katie.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today, and especially to talk about ethics, because it is something that I really am passionate about. Let's see, am I unmuted now? Am I good? All right. And I do want to say that I have to give credit for most of what you're going to hear today to the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration, which is the organization that has been home to our professional ethics in this profession for many years. So that's why you will see that credit here on the screen, and the website is there on this first screen if you want to learn more about CCVA. So let's consider this word ethics. How would you define it? What does it mean to you to behave ethically? for me, it's one of those words, those things that I kind of know what I mean when I say it, but it's tough to put it into a definition. Hard to know how to explain it because it is complicated. So here is one definition that comes from the internationally renowned Josephson Institute for Ethics. And they define ethics as a set of principles that define behavior as right, good, and proper. So that sounds pretty simple, right? However, they go on to clarify and remind us that the term ethics and the term values are not the same. I think many of us use these kind of interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same. Most values actually have nothing to do with ethics because they don't dictate how a moral person should behave. So for example, I can be very honest with you and tell you that one of my values is being highly organized, which certainly affects my behavior, both professionally and personally. But that value does not tell me anything about right or wrong. However, if I tell you that I also value being respectful of other people, then we can immediately feel a connection to ethical behavior and what behavior is good and proper. We know that a lot of NGOs and businesses have codes of ethics these days. Sometimes they're posted up on the wall, and they have lots of good reasons for having those codes. Ethics can definitely mean different things to different people, so we have to keep that in mind, but that makes it extra complicated and confusing. And lastly, ethical dilemmas do occur when ethical values clash with each other, and I'm going to go into that more in just a minute. So what does this general definition and theory have to do with our work with volunteers? Well, let's start with a very simple idea that we all can understand. Think of ethics as a backpack that each of us carries with us. Your ethics backpack is part of who you are and influences how you behave. It is deeply personal and unique. Yes, I may have some of the same contents in my backpack as you have in yours, but other content could be quite different. Therefore, we can never assume that another's ethical backpack is exactly the same as our own. Now let's look a little bit more closely at what is in this ethical backpack. There are actually 3 buckets of contents. So the first are our personal ethics, and these are just that. They're mine, they're very subjective, and they are influenced by my history, my experience, perhaps my religious beliefs, perhaps my ethnic culture, influenced by lots of things over my lifetime. My personal ethics is what guides my immediate reaction to a situation. It's what prompts that little voice that pops up and says, "Oh, that's not right. That person is not behaving ethically." And so it also is what defines doing the right thing for me personally. The next group of contents in this backpack are organizational ethics. And these are sets of principles that govern the behavior of a group of people. This is where codes of ethics come in, or some organizations call them guiding values. The purpose of these organizational values or ethical principles is to ensure consistency of action. Because when you're part of a group or an organization, either as an employee or even as a volunteer, we can't have everybody just acting according to their own personal ethics. We have to have something that everyone agrees on, that they will abide by those rules when they are representing our organization. And then the third bucket of content is professional ethics. And these are values and principles that apply to a specific field of activity. And probably when you hear professional ethics, you think immediately of medical professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants. There are fundraising professionals now have codes of ethics. Human resources managers, personnel managers have their codes of ethics. Lots of professions have them these days. And they define a universally accepted set of practices in those kinds of settings. And that's the type of ethics we're going to talk about mostly today. So with all of this content in our backpacks, is it any surprise that sometimes there's conflict? Hopefully there's a great deal of overlap and synergy between these three types of ethics in our own backpacks. But it's very possible that something in our personal ethics could clash with what's in organizational ethics or professional ethics. And that's when ethical dilemmas occur, and it's why they are so difficult to navigate. Believe it or not, the discussion of ethics related to volunteer management first began about 50 years ago, when our role of volunteer management was struggling to be recognized as a legitimate type of paid work. Ethics is one of the defining characteristics for any profession, and the first statement of ethics in volunteer administration was developed in the 1970s as a way for practitioners back then to signal to their colleagues and their bosses that they took this work very seriously. Later on, this early document was updated and revised by members of the Association for Volunteer Administration, AVA, based on research done by the Josephson Institute that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, AVA as an association had to dissolve in 2006. And so at that time, the ownership of the ethics material was transferred to CCVA. And then it was updated again in 2016 to make sure that it remained relevant and useful to practitioners and also educators. So that's just a little bit of background on where this material comes from. Now that we understand the three types of ethics in our backpack, let's look more closely at that professional ethics bucket of content. This slide shows the 5 core values for volunteer engagement professionals: citizenship, respect, accountability, fairness, and trust. You may wonder where they came from. How is it decided that these would be the values that would be at the heart of our professional ethics? Well, years ago, the Josephson Institute conducted extensive international research throughout the globe, which led to the conclusion that all kinds of people everywhere agree on a set of core ethical values, or what Josephson called the pillars of character. Now, when I first heard this, I was astounded that all kinds of people, human beings around the world with all sorts of backgrounds could agree on a common set of core values to guide behavior. We don't all call them the same things, but this research demonstrated that at the heart of those, there are these ideas, these concepts that we all believe in are in promoting moral, good behavior. So these universal values have become the basis for many professional codes of ethics, including ours. Now, I'm going to walk through each of these in more detail, and there's a one-page handout, which I believe Rhiannon might have been sent out in advance, but also I think she's going to put a link in the chat so you can download it. So this summarizes the actual core values and principles that I'm going to review quickly here, and means you don't have to take a bunch of notes and everything. You can just use that one pager if you'd like. So the first one is citizenship. The administrator volunteers understands that volunteerism is a foundation of civil societies and guides the organization and its stakeholders toward active community participation. Under this value, there are 3 principles, and you'll see the same format is carried through the entire document. Under citizenship, we have the responsibility that we have as professionals to have a clear personal philosophy on volunteerism. We must facilitate a compassionate and caring culture in our organizations, and we must cultivate and model a philanthropic spirit of time, giving time and resources. The second value is respect. And this involves acknowledging the inherent value, skills, and abilities of all individuals and affirming the mutual benefit gained by both volunteer and the organization. Under this value, there are 3 principles of dignity, upholding the right of all volunteers to be valued and involved in decisions that affect them. The principle of inclusivity, very relevant today, encouraging participation of individuals from diverse backgrounds and abilities. And of course, privacy, very familiar one to all of us, right? Protecting the confidentiality of individuals and information. The next value is accountability, demonstrating a responsibility to the organization, its stakeholders, and our profession. So here we see how we're sort of at this hub with a connection to those other buckets in our backpack. This includes the principle of collaboration, where we cultivate lots of partnerships, the principle of continuous improvement, which means that we need to continue as individuals to pursue excellence by enhancing our professional competence and maintaining certifications and fostering innovation. And the third principle here of professionalism, providing outstanding service to our organization and the people that it serves. The next value is fairness. We commit to individual and collective efforts that build and support a fair and just organizational culture. And here we see some more terms that are so familiar to us and so relevant to today. Impartiality, that means that we must remain unbiased and objective when we're working with the stakeholders. Equity, ensuring access to opportunities, resources, and support which enable volunteers to be successful. And justice, implementing open and consistent processes that inform decision-making and address discriminatory or prejudicial behaviors. And the last value is trust. We must maintain loyal and trusting relationships with all stakeholders and be dedicated to providing a safe environment based on established standards of practice. Principles here include honesty. We have to be truthful and strive for transparency. Integrity, demonstrating consistency between what we say and what we do. And we know that volunteers have a sixth sense about that, right? They can detect very quickly whether, what you all say on your website is not exactly what I see going on in this organization. So that's a very important one, and includes addressing conflicts of interest as well when they pop up. And then lastly, commitment, which is about acting in a forthright manner with good intent and following through on promises and agreements, which again, we know mean so much and are so important when we're working with volunteers. Now, I realize this has been a very quick introduction to the values and principles of our profession. There's a lot here to think about, and you're going to get to explore that a little bit further in this next, the rest of this hour. I'm sure that many of these words are familiar and not surprising to you. There's similar language that pops up in many codes of ethics, which is a good thing. And I actually find that very comforting, that this is not a set of new terminology. These are words that we're all very familiar with, and they echo in many other parts of our lives. In this document, those words have been tailored to the context in which we do our work. And I really encourage you to create some future opportunities to walk through these together and talk more about them as they relate to your work on the ground. Lastly, just want to share this wonderful quote with you. To me, this emphasizes and drives home the point that behaving ethically often requires courage. Moral courage, the quality of mind and spirit that enables us to face up to ethical dilemmas firmly and confidently without flinching or retreating. Practicing ethics in the real world is hard work. It can definitely make us want to run in the opposite direction and say, no, I don't want to deal with this. This is horrible. I'd rather just sort of ignore it. It does make us flinch sometimes. But by honing the skill of ethical decision-making, that's the way we build that moral courage and gain the confidence that we need to navigate the dilemmas we encounter in our daily work. Okay, so now I think I'm going to pass it on to Rob.
You are. Thank you, Katie. That's awesome. That's really, really good. And Rhiannon put the link to the CCVA ethics statement in the chat. So if you haven't already, it is well worth downloading that so that you have reference to it, because it's useful after today, but it's also going to be useful when you go into your breakout sessions in about 10 minutes time. More about that in a minute. But all I'm going to do is, I was kind of given the task of being a bit provocative, which if any of you have seen me talk before, I'm quite happy to do. So just to kind of flag up some of the kind of issues that we might come across at the moment in the kind of contemporary context that we're all operating in, that might give us pause to think about the ethical issues that we're talking about. And kind of just want to pick up really where Katie ended there, that many of these issues require us to have thought through our own personal as well as our organizational kind of philosophy and take on ethics in volunteer engagement. And my experience, kind of run a session on the philosophy of volunteering, is that quite often volunteer managers haven't done that at all, or organizations haven't done that at all, or we haven't done it recently. And I think it's really important regularly to just be checking in with ourselves, checking in with each other, in order to kind of make sure that our thinking is up to date. I can remember naively, almost 27 years ago as a volunteer manager, having a very purist view of what is and isn't volunteering and how all of that fits together. And that's a very, very different perspective than I have 27 years on, having dealt with a whole variety of different circumstances. So I just want to very quickly pick out 4 or 5 areas in which I think we need to think about these ethical issues. And for most of them, I'm going to do that just by raising some provocative questions, just some thoughts. They're not designed to reflect my opinions necessarily or HVG's, but just to get you thinking about this before we go into the breakout sessions. So it's already been highlighted that I think probably one of the biggest areas that we're going to have to think of in terms of ethics, if we haven't already over the course of the last year, is going to be around the whole issue of job displacement and job replacement. And I think there's some really interesting potential questions there. Is it our professional responsibility as the people responsible for bringing in and deploying volunteers in our organisations to make paid staff feel safe in their jobs? Or is our responsibility actually around helping the organisation deliver the services for the public and for the customers? Do we have an ethical responsibility to stand up for the rights of people who volunteer and who have the right to come in and volunteer with our organisation against those who feel that all the work that's done in our organisation should be paid? Do we have a moral and ethical obligation to ensure that our organisations strive to meet their missions first, rather than serve the needs of the paid staff that work for the organisation? Because most of our organisations are mission driven, and they're there to deliver a particular service to the public or whoever our constituency is, does our ethical responsibility lie to that rather than to the paid staff who may feel unjustly often threatened by volunteers? And if you take that to its logical conclusion, and its issue many heritage organisations have faced over the last decade or so of austerity, should we accept the closure of our organisations when we might actually be able to keep things going with volunteer support? And I know very close to where I live, in Grantham in Lincolnshire, that was very much a debate that our local museum had to get involved in when Lincolnshire County Council pulled its funding, and it switched to being entirely volunteer run and as a community hub and resource as a consequence. But if they just decided that volunteers should never do anything that paid staff had once done, then that resource would have gone from our community completely. There's also the role of volunteers, which brings me on to the role of volunteers in public and private services. So we quite often are comfortable with the idea of volunteers in non-profit or impact settings, but what about public and private sector? So as professionals, should we not facilitate volunteering by those taxpayers who have a right to volunteer in our organisations? So if we're publicly funded, then the volunteers are the very people who actually pay our wages, put the money into our organisations to help us continue to exist. Should we let our own personal beliefs, and this comes against in with the ethical toolkit that Katie was talking about, to what extent should we let our own personal beliefs drive our professional views and decisions? For example, that public service roles, certainly the more meaningful ones, should always be filled with paid staff. Many of you will have heard me talk in recent weeks about, should we therefore, if we're against the idea of volunteers doing meaningful roles in public services because all of those should be paid, should we therefore not be against the idea of volunteers being involved in the rollout of the vaccination programme, because there are 10,000 of them doing exactly the same role as paid colleagues? And would you be happy to wait an extra 6 months for your vaccine because it's only being delivered by paid staff rather than volunteers? And if it's acceptable in these current circumstances to have volunteers delivering those public services alongside paid staff, why isn't it acceptable at other times? Scenarios I've come across in the past of, should residents of privately run care homes miss out on support from volunteers compared to those who worked in non-profit or public sector run care homes, where maybe volunteering is a more palatable solution? And if volunteering for a private sector organisation is something that you or we may feel uncomfortable about accepting, then the question I quite often raise is, why were many of us therefore quite comfortable with volunteer involvement in London 2012 and Glasgow 2016, and if it happens, Birmingham 2022, where all of the organising committees for those major sporting events are private sector companies? I think we're going to have a big ethical debate for us over the course of the next few months. Again, some of you may have heard me talking about this in other sessions. In this balance between meeting the expectation of volunteers who increasingly want this frictionless, easy experience of volunteering versus our responsibilities of safeguarding, and safeguarding not only our colleagues and our other volunteers, but also members of the public, clients, depending on the context of our operation, and ethically stepping outside of our comfort blanket of being used to all the systems and processes and challenging those and making volunteering more accessible. And at the same time as meeting our safeguarding responsibilities. I think probably one of the biggest areas that we've kind of been challenged on this in the last year, and the HVG EDI group is doing some fantastic work on this, is in our work on equality, diversity and inclusion. So we know that we have certain legal obligations under the Equality Act, although the extent to which that covers volunteers is yet to be proven in many test cases, but we accept that we have that responsibility under the law. But then there's the ethical issues of to what extent are we prepared to tackle the attitudes of paid staff around EDI issues and other volunteers. It's by no accident that Helen Timbrell's excellent report last year on equality, diversity and inclusion, and particularly around race in volunteering, was called "What the bloody hell are you doing here?" because of the attitude of some volunteers towards other volunteers coming in with a different ethnic background. What about clients and visitors? And where do we draw the line? Whose views do we prioritise and whose views do we support? when we come across a really thorny issue that may be down to the way that a visitor to a museum is behaving towards a volunteer and the support that volunteer or member of the public gets from a member of paid staff. As well as the hiring policies for volunteers and for volunteer managers, because if we're honest, we're not the most diverse workforce in the world as volunteer managers. And how do we square that one with our personal ethics? And then finally, around agile working and digital futures. So we were having a conversation, those of us involved in organising this just before everybody joined, about future ways of working and almost digital by default. Do we need to get back into rooms full of people again? Do we need to get back into major events or bringing volunteers together? And quite often we assume digital by default is a good thing, but it also creates many digital exclusion issues, which are going to actually ramp up problems with equality, diversity and inclusion, rather than actually solving some of those problems. Are we confident in challenging organisational decisions where they're making decisions about the future way of working, the future structure and thinking and approach of our organisations without necessarily factoring volunteering into that thinking? And are we looking for those teachable moments to help educate others? And where do our personal ethics cross with our professional ethics and maybe our organisational values and ethics in all of that as well? So I think Katie did a good enough job of explaining that this was a minefield, and I've probably increased your anxiety and doubled the number of mines that you now have to cross in that minefield to think about that. But I just wanted to bring home, because as somebody who runs sessions like this myself, it can quite easily fall into one of those things that's nice to think about, but it's not the most pressing issue. And actually, I think it, as Katie was saying, it underlines many of the fundamental decisions that we make day in, day out, and could be a real cause of tension and stress for us as well, when we realise that our own personal and professional ethics and philosophies are maybe out of whack with those of our organisations and their approach to things. So that's just a few thoughts designed to be a bit provocative and get you thinking. What I want to do is move us into stopping from listening to Katie and myself, but move us into a time when you can get into some breakout rooms. In a moment, Will's going to put you into a number of breakout rooms. There is a facilitator for each of your breakout rooms. They will identify themselves. It's not like Among Us, where you have to discover who that person is by process of elimination. They will identify themselves. They're there basically just to get you talking and to make sure that they take some notes, and also to avoid you having the lengthy debate about who's going to feed back at the end of the breakout sessions, because in the little time that we'll have, I'm going to ask each of the facilitators just to feed back one main point. So the questions that we want you to consider are twofold. Considering the potential issues and conundrums that Katie and I have outlined, but also ones that you may be thinking about now as well, or discussing in the chat, which 2 or 3 have the most relevance for the group, and how do you feel that the ethical framework can help you to work through them? And what guidance and support might you need to use that ethical framework and or work through those issues? So that's a good opportunity to feed back to HVG and those of us on the steering group about any support as members you may feel you need in navigating these kinds of issues. So what are the issues and conundrums? The top 3 that have most relevance for your group. How can you work through those, and what support might you need? And then at the end of that, we'll take some feedback from the facilitator. So you'll have 15 minutes in your breakout rooms, which we'll commence putting you into now. Hope that was a helpful conversation. I'm guessing with the limited amount of time we had, it probably posed more questions than it gave answers, but at least it gave you an opportunity to engage in the conversation. We only have a very small handful of minutes, 5 minutes or so, and we had 6 breakout rooms. So I'm going to ask, please, the individual facilitators of the breakout room to give us literally 45 seconds of quick feedback on each of the breakout rooms. I did not have a list, Will, as to who was facilitating which group. So I don't know who I'm going from, but can you assist with that, or should we just do it as a free-for-all and see who talks first?
So I have one of the people was Tamzin. So if Tamzin's happy, I'll hand over to Tamzin.
Well, thanks.
Okay, so first of all, we all felt it was really helpful to have a safe space to talk about the ethical situations we're facing. So that concept of supervision was really great. So thank you. One of the conversations we had was around the concept of conflict between different hats that we might wear in different situations, especially working and volunteering in a very hyper-local space. And one of the suggestions that I gave was having a conflict register. I have that for my volunteers so that people can either flag a conflict in advance or during a particular activity or task, they can raise a conflict with me so it is on record. Right. And I think that's 45 seconds. But we also did talk about marginalised workforces, volunteering and historically enslaved people contributing to decolonising agendas.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamzin. That's brilliant. Vanessa, I know you were chairing your group because you were chairing mine, so.
Exactly. I think the key things, I can probably do it in less than 45 seconds. Key thing was very much about job retention, staff firsting volunteers, especially when you're in an environment where you potentially could be the bad cop that's going in to actually deal with actually closing something down, and how do you personally deal with that ethically, and how you get the unions involved with that as well, and trade unions obviously from that point of view. Sorry. And then the other side of it was the complete reverse is the diversity issue, and making sure that we're doing everything we can do to make sure that we are being ethically and morally correct in that as well. So very much about respecting, trusting and fairness and inclusivity and diversity. And what can we do more? We want to do more of these, more discussions where we can talk about it, chat about it, and safe space, like Tamzin said, so that we can actually learn from each other. More case studies as well. Definite favourite.
Well, thank you, Vanessa. And just very quickly on that one, because I'm involved in Engage, where Katie's article originally appeared, on our social media profile starting soon, we're going to start running What Would You Do Wednesdays, where we provide an ethical dilemma and we ask people on social media to say what would they do in those different circumstances. So if you don't already follow Engage on social media, go to engagejournal.org and follow along on our Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn and Instagram profiles, because you'll be able to be part of that. There you go, I got my plug in. Matt, I think you were chairing a group, weren't you?
I was indeed, yeah. We covered a lot of the discussions that have already been raised. So we talked about job replacement and displacement, the role of internships, and diversity and equality being kind of the three kind of main areas of relevance. We discussed the value of the ethical framework and its value in terms of providing us with the structure to have some of those difficult conversations within our organisations, and taking the personal out of those conversations. And then in terms of the kind of additional kind of guidance and support, that we felt it was really valuable that the framework was kind of underpinned by practical outcomes, or was able to demonstrate practical outcomes, and how, as leaders of volunteers, the framework can be threaded through our practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Ruth, did you lead a group as well?
Yep. So our main conversations kind of focused on our responsibility to the safety of our volunteers, and how some of that, it feels like it's kind of veering into territory that's potentially a bit too personal in terms of whether people's health and whether or not people have had vaccinations or are happy to have vaccinations. And then balancing that with our responsibility to inclusive practice and trying to include volunteers and allow people to volunteer as much as we can, while balancing the need, our responsibility to keep them safe. And it was generally kind of accepted that it would vary. It varied a lot depending on different organisations and different sectors as well that we're working in, and that kind of signposting to ethical practice guidance would be really helpful in kind of a simplified form. And also a really good suggestion was examples as well of how this can work in practice.
Cool, thanks Ruth. Thank you very much. Rich. I believe we've got Rich and Ben left, so.
Yeah, I was in the same group as Ruth.
You're in the same group as Ruth? Awesome, Ben.
Yeah, so we just talked a little bit about how recognising every organisation is different, therefore their ethical code will be very different. So what is ethical in one organisation will not be in another. So while we want more examples and more case studies, it's kind of recognising that. And that led to a conversation about understanding your organisation's critical need, and that when we are explaining our volunteer roles, that is what shapes perhaps why they're there. I think it was Michelle gave a great example of a volunteer who refused to do a role because they felt it belonged to a paid member of staff. So it was kind of understanding that complex. We kind of talked about a lot, and mirroring everyone else, we said more of this, more sessions, and actually having the opportunity maybe to talk to our volunteers about this topic, because they do get it. They have their own sense of what this is. So yeah, just developing some opportunities to do that.
Oh, thanks, Ben. And last but not least, Rhiannon, who I can then also hand over to wrap the session up at the end when she's given the feedback from her group.
Oh, it's like we planned it, Rob. We, very similar, to be honest, we had 3 examples of changes that have happened over the years where staff have been let go, volunteers have been on pause, and then how do you sort of manage the staffing in inverted commas of your organisation. Interesting, one of them was a few years back, so we were sort of talking a lot about how respect went a long way, and there wasn't initially respect between the staff and volunteers in their different displaced roles, but how engendering that really did help over time. But actually what we were talking a little bit about was how personal feelings come into this a lot, and how that potentially creates problems and reputational risk as well for an organisation if managed badly. And we talked about sort of how you could staff an organisation when your staff volunteer ratios change and flux. And was if you look at reallocating activities and tasks, is that simply camouflage for the wider change that's happening underneath? So a lot of debate. We didn't necessarily conclude in our group, a lot of thinking. And I would just echo, we didn't get to question 2, but I would echo that perhaps following up on some of these conundrums in future sessions and dedicating whole sessions to them would be really valuable, because it was quite a romp through such valuable content today. A huge thank you to Rob and Katie, because this is just the starter. I think that's the other thing to say, is that we wanted to use this session as a way to introduce this topic to you, get you starting to think about the concept of professional ethics, personal ethics, and how they combine and what they form as a result, so that we can continue. I also need to put my teeth in like Matt. So we can continue to have these discussions in more depth over the coming weeks and months. So on that note, if anyone does want to sort of feedback to us about this session and particular areas from this session that you'd like to see more of, please do drop us a line at HVG, or you can pop it in the chat box now, because we will start to use some of what we've learned from you guys today to pick up future content within HVG's programming.